Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series in which I take historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious, and I try to examine them and situate them within their historical context, just to provide a bit of basic understanding of where they were historically and what they were doing. But in doing this, I also try to pick on a game system that represents these vessels and see how fairly they've been treated. Now, I apologize for the length of time it's been since the last episode of Ships of War, but I was really struggling with what to do for the next one, and various excellent suggestions have been received, which I've put down on my to-do list. But the one that I was really quite fascinated by, the pairing that I really want to explore today, is another carrier-on-carrier comparison. And it's two ships that are represented in R. Ben Madison's excellent game, Mrs. Thatcher's War. And I'm speaking of the two aircraft carriers that were the core of both sides' fleets in this conflict. So for the British, we have HMS Hermes. And for the Argentine Navy, it's Vienticinco de Mayo. I apologize if my pronunciation of the ship's name is off, but of course, Vienticinco de Mayo is 25th of May in English. So I have here in front of me the counters for both the Hermes and the Vienticinco de Mayo. And the first thing you'll notice is that I've set myself a bit of a challenge, because in terms of talking about these ships, in terms of how fairly they're represented in a game system, well, hardcore war gamers among you will notice that there are no stats on these ships whatsoever. So what on earth am I going to do with this? Well, I will get to that, because the game treats both these ships in very different ways and in a very interesting way. But let's get on to a bit of history first. So why do these two carriers make such an interesting pairing? Because, of course, when you talk about the naval element of the Falklands War, I think the one that instantly pops into most people's minds is the unfortunate cruiser General Belgrano and the terrible fate that befell her. But I think that tends to cloud the overall strategic appreciation that certainly in the Royal Navy Task Force, the carriers were working really, really hard, and in the with the I'll call her the 25th of May to stop myself stumbling over the pronunciation all the time. Vienticinco de Mayo. I can do this if I try. The Argentines had actually a potentially very capable strike vessel. The problem was, for reasons that we'll soon see, she wasn't quite able to be everything she could have been. So to the history, one reason I find the antagonists so fascinating is because at the end of the day, both vessels were quintessentially British. I mean, Hermes, of course, yes, was British from start to finish. But the Vienticinco de Mayo had a very, very interesting journey before she ended up in the Argentine Navy. So I'll start with her because she's the older vessel. So she began her life as one of the British Colossus-class light fleet carriers. Now, towards the middle of the Second World War, the Royal Navy had appreciated for a long time that it would need lots and lots of aircraft carriers, but they were also aware that British production capacity was stretched to the limit. So the Colossus class and the similar carriers that were planned represented a sort of hybrid where they were almost as capable as a British fleet carrier in terms of the numbers of aircraft they could operate. Some of them could push to a maximum of 40 to 48 aircraft, which is not bad for a British carrier. But these were fleet carriers on the cheap. They were not large ships. They were essentially a flight deck with the bare minimum was required in terms of aircraft maintenance, services, propulsion. They were basically stripped back to brass tacks. So whereas British carriers of the Second World War era, famous for being heavily armoured and very well designed, These were not. The Colossus class were just there to provide loads of extra flight decks. The idea being that their main protection would be the large numbers of aircraft they could collectively bring to the party. And so the HMS Venerable, as she was commissioned in 1945 and so did technically serve in the Second World War for its last few months. And at the end of the conflict, when Britain had far more ships than she could afford to keep, the poor old Colossus class were among the first to let's just say it was expedient to find new owners for them. Quite a few of them went to allied nations or newly liberated European countries. Some went further afield. So HMS Venerable was given to the Dutch as the Karel Doorman. And here is a picture of her in Dutch service. And so you can see quite a handsome looking vessel, really, and very, very businesslike. Those of you who know your carriers will see that she is actually quite basic. She's not very large. You can judge her size by the aircraft parked on the deck. I believe those are Hellcats back there, and then there's some Avengers lurking around on the forward end of the flight deck too. So you've got, this is not an enormous carrier, but she can do the job. She can maintain and operate a fairly substantial air wing. Now, she served quite happily for a few years from 1948 onwards in the Dutch Navy, but unfortunately in the 1950s she suffered from a very serious engine fire which took her out of circulation for a bit. In the end, this turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise because she was heavily rebuilt by the Dutch. Didn't alter her outward appearance very much, but internally she was completely reconditioned through the latter half of the 1950s. And she was even re-engined a bit later because there was another carrier of the same class, HMS Leviathan, which ultimately was never completed, but her engines were. So the Karel Doorman was re-engined with the machinery from HMS Leviathan. It's a beautiful thing about a large class of nearly identical carriers. You can chop and change and they can contribute spare parts to each other, sometimes on an incredibly extensive level. She remained in Dutch service until she was purchased by the Argentine Navy in the 1960s. And here is an official Argentine photograph of her in service with them, I think a short while either before or after the Falklands War. And looking back, if you look at the various details, look at what she's got along her hull, the radar and detection arrays, just, little details. If you look at this 1970s photo of, or even, mid-1980s photo of her, not an awful lot has changed. In fact, the only major thing the Argentines did to her was to widen her flight deck very slightly for basically to give her the angled flight deck capability. But hardly anything else about the vessel changed when the Argentines took her on. Some of her detection systems were upgraded, but it wasn't to any huge degree. And she entered the Falklands War very much the same carrier that had come out of Dutch hands about a decade earlier. So not that much to say about her in her later career, except that she was a very, very old ship in 1982. But she was pretty much the only aircraft carrier that Argentines had. So that's brought the Venerable / Karel Doorman / Vienticinco de Mayo up to date. What about HMS Hermes? HMS Hermes had an even more protracted start to life. So she was actually laid down as a member of the British Centaur class before the end of the Second World War. She was actually laid down in June 1944, just days after D-Day. But she wasn't complete by the end of the war. And in the massive slowdown in building that took place in the really cash-strapped post-war years, the hull was not actually launched until 1953. Now, this was not just a money problem. It was also the fact that the specification for her completion was revised. They could see that change was ahead, and Hermes was a big carrier. She was going to be one of the carriers that ultimately took the fleet into the post-war future. So they didn't want to just crank out another standard Centaur class. They decided they would work in some changes. Mainly, they wanted to give her a really a modern 6.5-degree angled flight deck, a side lift in the manner of the new American carriers, and some better detection systems and command and control systems. So between this and the strapped funds, the hull was not launched until 1953. And the ship was not actually completed, as in properly commissioned into the fleet, until 1959. So that is an awfully long time. That's more than a decade between the keel being laid and the ship being completed. And while Hermes was a good carrier when she was first completed, she also had one very serious problem. At heart, she was a Second World War design, vastly improved, but still a Second World War design. Now, this is a picture of her taken as completed. You can tell because she's got her massive dustbin radar up there. But look at the aircraft on her deck. These are all jet planes. These are the first generation of British carrier jets. This is the age of the Sea Vixen and the Buccaneer. The problem with Hermes is that she simply didn't have the length of flight deck or the capacity to operate a very large number of these aircraft. So as commissioned, she could carry and operate about 20 jets, various assortments. So not a very big air wing, very capable aircraft, but not a very big air wing. And her problems got a bit worse because as time moved on and the homegrown British aircraft began to be replaced by newer models, US models primarily, Hermes became less and less capable. In fact, by the time the Phantom was introduced into British service, she struggled to operate these very demanding US jets that needed larger flight decks. And it wasn't that she couldn't operate them, but the requirements of the Phantom meant that she could not operate a credible air wing. And that was the main trouble. So although she was much more capable than her near sisters of the Centaur class, plans were put in to convert her to the same sort of role that they had been given over to, which was helicopter carrier, commando carrier, really supporting and being a part of combined operations rather than a fleet carrier as such. And so by the 1970s, although the ship had been progressively upgraded and continued to, be kept relevant that way, she was very much going down the road of the helicopter carrier. And as the 70s drew on, the Royal Navy was faced with some rather serious budget cuts. So again, the older and less capable carriers were coming under scrutiny because, the Navy needed to save its money, and there were some major deductions in frontline strength coming up. Hermes was saved, ironically enough, by the Falklands War. She was also saved by the introduction of the Harrier, the VTOL jump jet, because that instantly solved her problems. So here's a photograph, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a grainy one, taken of her around 1982. I think it is a Falklands War image. And while in many respects she's not that much changed from the ship that she was, you can see that the dustbin radar has gone and been replaced by a much more modern set of detection systems. She's also got that extra bit on the other side of her island superstructure to make deck work more efficient. And she's also, most significantly, acquired a ski jump ramp. Very, very helpful when you're operating jet aircraft and very useful even when you've got Harriers. So the Falklands War gave the British a reason to blow the dust off poor old Hermes. She was slated for the scrapyard. Equip her with as many carriers and Sea Kings as she could manage and send her off to the Falklands, effectively to go and meet her former counterpart down in the South Atlantic. So here we come to a direct comparison of the ships. So looking at them as they were in 1982, I think it's helpful just to give you an idea of what the difference in size was like for these ships. So looking at their tonnage, allowing for the Argentine modifications, the Vienticinco de Mayo topped out at nearly 20,000 tons. So she's a big ship, but she's not that big for a fleet carrier. Hermes is a bit more like it. By 1982, the ship's weighing in at close to 30,000 tons. I think the exact figure was in the region of 28,700, 29,000 tons. Dimensionally, neither ship had changed much in the hull. So Vienticinco de Mayo was 693 foot, give or take, overall length, and 80 foot in the beam. Hermes somewhat longer, but not quite so much, at 744 foot, about nearly 745 in length, but 160 foot in the beam, so she's a much beamier carrier. And thanks to Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships, I've got these helpful comparative drawings. I hope you can see these okay. I'll pull them up a bit. So these are to scale. Hermes has, who's down here, has something of a size advantage over the Vienticinco de Mayo. But you can see that slightly beamier hull is reflected in the width of the flight deck, which is directly supported by the hull. Hermes, of course, has this massive advantage with a much more pronounced angled deck. If they were operating conventional aircraft, it would be very useful. Of course, Hermes is not too bothered because she has Harriers, but for the Vienticinco de Mayo, it is a bit of a problem. You can just about see the angled deck modification that the Argentines put in, but it's not quite as pronounced or as big as that. What about speed? Because speed is a very important attribute in an aircraft carrier. Now, Hermes had pretty much still got the machinery that she was born with, and Vienticinco de Mayo, as we know, had inherited the machinery from HMS Leviathan. So she had newer engines, but they were effectively the engines she was originally designed to have. You'll be shocked to learn that these two very similar British-designed aircraft carriers were both twin-shaft geared turbines powered by 4 Admiralty 3-drum boilers. However, Hermes's engines seem to have managed to get her up to a more efficient speed. So by 1982, and I'm not totally clear on how far this was maintenance problems, it never does to stereotype, but it partly due to funding and partly due to other reasons. The Argentine maintenance in the fleet was really not quite what it should have been. So by 1982, the Vienticinco de Mayo can make a respectable 24 knots if she really pushes herself, but usually it's closer to the 20 mark. Hermes does somewhat better. She could go 28 knots if she was going flat out. But on the whole, the British never really ran her that quickly unless they had to. They were aware that her engines and her systems were really quite elderly and they didn't want to push their luck. So most of the time, if she had to go quick, she would push up to about the 20-knot range, or faster if she was launching aircraft. But more often it was at 20 or maybe even slightly less, depending, because they also had to watch their fuel supplies, being at the end of a very long logistical tail. So in the context of 1982, no real speed advantage to either side. Now, the two never fought each other directly. The operation which saw the sinking of the General Belgrano was the only time when these ships, or perhaps more accurately their air wings, might conceivably have come into contact. But of course, the Vienticinco de Mayo was withdrawn for very good reasons, really. Operational conditions and the state of her air wing meant that an attack on the Royal Navy Task Force was really not that feasible a prospect. But had it come to it, how well protected were the two ships? Well, I'm going to look at their active defensive systems first, and by that I mean their air wings. So, in total, the Vienticinco de Mayo had 22 aircraft assigned to her. This was her maximum paper strength. And the aircraft she had were the A4Q Skyhawks. Now, these are represented in the game. That is their counter, and that is their simplified combat rating. But I do need to qualify this because for operations during the war, a lot of the Skyhawks served in a land capacity, and at most the Vienticinco de Mayo only ever seems to have carried 8 Skyhawks, along with 4 trackers for reconnaissance duties and a couple of helicopters. So it's not that impressive an air wing. Hermes went to sea with a total of 20 Harriers and 10 Sea King helicopters. So there's the Harrier as represented in the game, and HH is Harrier Hermes. So in the game, she is given 10 of these counters. So assuming you don't lose any, there's a fairly decent pool of aircraft that you have. Now, I think the 10 counters is meant to represent both an operational limit and a scaling down to make the game manageable. Now, neither of these aircraft are really all that suitable in an anti-ship role, because while the Skyhawk was designed for that kind of aerial attack, a lot of the Argentine Skyhawks, in fact the majority, did not have onboard radar systems. And one of the great failings of the Vienticinco de Mayo was that she lacked the equipment to provide the aircraft with directional information. She couldn't feed them accurate data to vector them to the target. So effectively, the Argentine pilots would have been forced to fight a carrier battle under what really would have been Second World War conditions. You know, they're having to try and eyeball their target half the time, relying on the carrier launching them in the right direction at the point of takeoff. The British were much better off in that respect, but the Harrier was optimized more for attacking ground targets and engaging aircraft in the sky. I don't think they had much in the way of ship-killing offensive capacity. So I think, on the whole, the Harriers probably would have been used in the combat air patrol role. And they would have been very good at it, because in the game, the Harrier is given a combat rating of 7. Whereas the poor old A4 Skyhawk has a combat rating of 4. So not only did Hermes have an advantage in numbers, she had the more capable jet fighters. It wouldn't have been much fun if the Vienticinco de Mayo's air wing had actually found their target, especially as British detection systems were better. Now, what about the ship's own defensive systems? I'll move these guys to one side for a minute because, again, just to remind you, there are no stats printed on these. Now, both were fairly minimalist. The Vienticinco de Mayo had about 9 or 10 40mm Bofors AA guns. And while these were, to a limited degree, radar guided, they really were not what you wanted to be defending your aircraft carrier with in the missile age. It really wasn't all that good. And also, their positioning around the ship, mostly around the island superstructure and in a couple of gun tubs here and there, they were very good for all-round defense. But to shoot down a missile in this period, you probably wanted a better arrangement where their fire could be grouped. And she didn't really have that. She'd very much inherited the Second World War era gun positioning, even though the Bofors guns had been significantly upgraded. We seem to have lost our... There we go. Let's zoom in a tiny bit. It's gone a bit fuzzy. The Hermes, to be perfectly honest, was not that much better off. She had 2 Seacat launchers mounted near the stern, one to port, one to starboard. Now, the Seacat was a highly regarded missile in theory, in terms of its ability to knock down enemy aircraft or enemy missiles. But in practice, the Seacat launchers did not do all that well in the Falklands War. Come on, camera, focus. We want to see these lovely ships. So, had the Hermes been attacked, it would have been a bit touch and go as to whether these would have been able to protect her. Now, naturally, she had escorting warships and a CAP, Combat Air Patrol, but these would have been the main meat of her protection. What about passive defences, armour? Well, as I alluded to at the beginning, the Colossus-class light fleet carriers had no armour protection worthy of the name, and Vienticinco de Mayo hadn't acquired any in the intervening years. So, as far as an incoming British missile was concerned, or torpedo, she might as well have just been made of plain steel, and there would have been very little in the way of defence. Hermes did have some protection over her magazines, but it really wasn't all that great. She certainly wasn't a Second World War style armoured flight deck carrier. So, as completed, and she still had these during the Falklands War, she had slightly armoured mantlets over her magazines, but we're only talking about 1.5 inches of additional plating. I doubt it would have kept very much out. She also had extra plating to reinforce her flight deck, so you're almost tempted to call it an armoured flight deck in theory, but this extra reinforcement plating was less than 1 inch thick. And even though it was pretty high quality steel, it wouldn't have kept anything out, I don't think. Certainly not modern weaponry, and it would definitely not have said no to an Exocet. So, to all intents and purposes, both ships were pretty much unarmoured. So, how do they function in the game? Well, Hermes is pretty much there as a target that you can lose. As I say, her main strength is in her aircraft, her air wing. As long as she is in the game, she gives the British player an immense punch. But if the British lose her, it is a catastrophe. She has no intrinsic capabilities of her own beyond the ability to launch aircraft. So, actually, in the context of the Falklands War, I think that's a fair representation of the Hermes and what she was. What about the Vienticinco de Mayo? She only exists as a marker, really. She's a target that can be attacked. She can't launch any strikes of her own, which again I think is fair. She simply was not up to the standards of this war. Now, as a point of interest, immediately after the Falklands War, the ship was upgraded with better systems to enable her to communicate effectively with her air wing. And she was also improved slightly so that she could operate the brand new Super Étendard jet fighters. And that would have made her a very capable vessel indeed if she'd had that ability. Sadly for them, the Argentine Navy didn't implement this until the end of the conflict. So she really exists as a marker to cause problems for the British. She inhibits British operations if she is at sea. Now, interestingly, the British cannot attack her with airstrikes, and I think that's a reflection of both the manner in which she was employed, very close to supporting air bases for most of the conflict, but also the fact that the British had much better things to do with their Harriers, and also that their aircraft were not actually that well equipped for ship-killing missions. I mean, they could do it, but it wasn't really their forte. The only way that you can attack the Vienticinco de Mayo as the British player is with one of your submarines. And to be perfectly honest, that's probably the way the British would have played it had that option come up. It could have been the Vienticinco de Mayo instead of the Belgrano, or even, worst case scenario for the Argentines, as well as. So that too, I think, is a fair representation of her and her capabilities. In this era of missile age warfare, your carriers are very much targets and little else. Vitally important targets that need to be protected. So I think overall the game, in the minimalist way it deals with the two ships, is very fair in its treatment of them. And I suppose the only thing to say by way of wrapping up is what happened to them afterwards. Hermes came home in triumph, having played a vital role in the conflict. But the reprieve that the Falklands War had bought her, saving her from the scrapyard, unfortunately was not enough to keep her going very long in the post-war world. By the late 1980s, she had vanished from the Royal Navy's frontline strength list. She'd only really intended to be brought back as a stopgap until all three of the new Invincible-class through-deck cruisers were in service and operational. The Argentines wanted to keep the Vienticinco de Mayo going longer, but ironically enough, a year or two after they put all this effort into upgrading her and making her combat worthy for the war that they'd already unfortunately lost, she began to show her age primarily in the form of persistent power plant and engineering problems. And by 1986, she was no longer worthy to be a frontline unit. She'd effectively been taken out of service. So, I mean, fair dues, both these ships were very old in 1982 in warship terms. They'd served their time, they did extremely well. Vienticinco de Mayo was never really given a fair chance to show what she could have done, but then conversely, you could argue quite, I think there's a strong case for saying that she was hopelessly outmatched anyway. Hermes put in an absolutely sterling performance for her final mission, final deployment, I should say, and served the Royal Navy extremely well in one of its most desperate hours, and did herself very, very proud. So I hope that's been an interesting look at these two fascinating warships. I very much enjoy Mr. Madison's game, Mrs. Thatcher's War, and I will actually be playing it again fairly soon. And it's been great visiting these two, even though it's yet another aircraft carrier on aircraft carrier comparison. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much to all of you who've been following this series. If you've any comments, queries, etc., please do make them. I will respond as quickly as I can. To all my veterans out there, a huge hello and thank you so much for staying with me. As ever, guys, it's wonderful having your company. I really appreciate it and thanks so much. To anyone who may be visiting my channel for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do check out the rest of the Ships of War series if that's the kind of thing that interests you. If you came here because of Mrs. Thatcher's War, the game, please have a look at my other videos on this subject. Or if it's wargaming in general, have a wander around the channel. You're more than welcome. I hope you find something else you like. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, thank you so much for your time watching this. As always, hugely appreciated. And I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Bye.